Hi, this is Janae Sharp from the Sharp Index, and we are sitting down today with one of my favorite experts in women's mental health. And I'm so excited to talk to you, and with Tristan, and I was hoping everybody could introduce themselves. We know each other, but for the people who are watching the video, I'm Janae Sharp. I'm the founder of the Sharp Index. It's a nonprofit dedicated to reducing physician suicide and burnout.
Hi, everybody. I am Dr. Pooja Lakshmin. I am a perinatal psychiatrist specializing in women's mental health. I'm also a frequent contributor for the New York Times and an author. I have a book coming out in 2023 with Penguin Random House that is all about the tyranny of self-care. And I have a company that I started last year that's called Gemma. We are a women's mental health digital education platform. So lots of different hats that I wear, but I'm super excited to be here with you, Janae and Tristan, and to chat a little bit about women's mental health.
I'm an intern at the Sharp Index, and I'm also a student getting my master's in healthcare administration. And I'm just excited to be here also.
Yeah, so I wanted to start, I feel like I met you online when I was pregnant and had we'd known each other before, but I was pregnant and I was like, I love her stuff. Like I just kept reading your stuff. And I like that idea, like the tyranny of self-care, because I remember like going through death and then pregnancy, everyone's like, take time for yourself. And you're like, where am I supposed to invent that from? Like
Right. It's so easy for people to say, you know, are you taking care of yourself? Like, why don't you go to a yoga class? Why don't you take a bath? Like, right. And all those things are great, but it's like, how do you actually make any of those things happen? You know, and part of what I'm going to be writing about in the book and what I'm working on right now as I'm writing the book is kind of like what, you know, one of my hypotheses is that real self-care is not a noun, it's a verb. Right? Mm-hmm. The real self-care is all of the work that you have to do internally to actually make these decisions and set boundaries and have hard conversations with your loved ones so that you can actually take that bath or go to that yoga class or whatever the thing is. So that's like kind of where the real work happens. And I think that the whole self-care industry obviously completely preys on women in particular, and it's just selling us all of this stuff that, you know, are just kind of like band-aids for the real problems, which we know are all structural. You know, it's impossible to take care of yourself if you don't have good childcare, and childcare is, you know, exorbitant in our country, and, you know, not having, universal paid parental leave, right? All of these systemic issues that are actually the real problem. But instead, of course, our society wants to just make it about moms doing more.
Right. Like it's very much like do more so you can match up. And I like what you say about like changing the structure. We have a fund too that's dedicated to like paying for childcare for moms who are like studying. And I'm really looking forward to reading your book too.
Thank you. I'm in the process of writing it, which is, you know, its own Herculean effort, but, I think it's just one of those things that in my practice, especially over the past couple of years, I've seen so many more patients that are coming in that are, you know, moms, because I take care of women, but a lot of my patients are mothers. They're just like, I'm burnt out, I'm exhausted, I have no time. And I feel like it's my fault because I haven't learned how to meditate. I'm not doing self-care, right? So it's just like this added burden that again, falls on women, falls on moms. And that's heartbreaking to me because the last thing that anybody should feel is more guilt, right?
Right. The last thing they need is that.
With how crazy it's been with COVID, what like changes have you seen in women's mental health from the past year compared to before?
Yeah, so COVID has really been devastating for maternal mental health. So rates of depression and anxiety have gone up almost triple fold during pregnancy and postpartum during the pandemic. So some studies have even shown that rates of anxiety for women that are pregnant or postpartum are as high as almost 70%. So it's like, it's really this crisis that we've seen over this past year. And the reasons for that are one, during the pandemic, because of social distancing and all the precautions that we had to take, which were for good reason, but you couldn't have that social support. You didn't have your village that you might have had previously, couldn't have friends or family members coming over. And then also, obviously, all the changes that came with prenatal care and delivery, especially in kind of the height of the pandemic, not being able to have anybody there with you while you were delivering your baby. And then also just the uncertainty and the anxiety around not knowing for so long how COVID was impacting pregnancy or could potentially impact your baby. There's just a lot of anxiety. And so I was seeing patients who, people that had never been on medication before, having to go on medication, people that were on medication, having worsening symptoms. So we had to, increase doses and things like that. So it's definitely been really, really tough for everybody, but certainly for people that are, have been pregnant or postpartum.
I'm curious too, to know, do you feel like that's especially bad for the physician population, like physician mothers? I don't know if that's something you would know about.
Yeah, absolutely. So like frontline healthcare workers have been kind of doubly hit if they were pregnant and postpartum. And I have some friends actually who are physicians and had their babies during the pandemic. And absolutely 100%, because many of them were still working during the pandemic, working in ERs, taking shifts, being exposed. And it's this kind of really impossible moral dilemma to be in, because as a physician or as a healthcare provider, you're wanting to be there for your patients and be a source of comfort and safety during a global crisis like this, but then also to know that, you want your baby and your family to be safe. So I know so many physicians that we're still working on the front lines while also pregnant. And so, it's really tough.
It was a disaster a little bit.
Yeah.
For my friends who were physicians too.
Yeah. I mean, I think the good news is that if there is any good news, maybe I shouldn't call it good news, but kind of the silver lining is that telemedicine has become so much more acceptable during this time period. So people are able to kind of like link up with therapists or psychiatrists and do video calls and video chats to be able to get services. But the downside of that is that everybody's full. It's really hard to find a therapist or a psychiatrist right now because there's just so much more need.
Right. The need is so much higher.
Yeah.
So I feel like structurally, like we're kind of sabotaging things for moms and for women. Like we talk about it being broken a lot and we know it's broken, but does that mean paid parental leave? Does that mean childcare? What do you think a healthier system looks like, besides that we would actually have like therapists for people who need it?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's all of those things. I think it's actually giving value to the work that happens inside the home. And instead of devaluing it and pretending that it doesn't exist, that all of that work was equally as valued and paid and compensated. So, I think part of that is having women's time and emotional energy, that mental load that women are the ones that are kind of holding, especially in heterosexual relationships, having that time and energy and mental load be valued and appreciated and even compensated, right? I think there's a lot of stuff happening, in the public sphere right now, especially with the change in administration. So like, hopefully these are places that our country will decide to go. But I think that really we need to be like looking at this as a structural issue.
I guess like one thing I watched your Good Morning America segment, and you talked about like the burnout versus betrayal and kind of like the system and looking at that. So could you kind of explain that for the video and just kind of what you mean by how like the system is betraying and not it's just falling on the individual when it shouldn't be falling on just the individual?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's such an important piece, and that goes with these systemic failures, because, what we're seeing with that word burnout, right, is that, again, burnout puts the burden and the shame on the individual. You should be working harder. You should be taking care of yourself better. And it's your fault that you became burned out during this pandemic. Where instead we look at the fact that, there are all of these ways in which our country did not support families over this past year. So instead of thinking of this as burnout, I think one of the things that I'm really passionate about is, again, just turning it back around on the systems and saying, no, we've been betrayed by these systems. We had states where, they were prioritizing keeping bars and malls and, water parks open instead of actually looking at how can we keep schools safe and keep teachers safe, right? Like, our priorities and the decisions that the people that were in charge made were not supportive of families and were betraying mothers, because mothers were the ones that had to pick up this burden, right? Because they didn't have a choice. So I think that's, for me, and working with patients, like kind of shifting that frame and always bringing it back to the fact that these are structural betrayals. This is not burnout. Burnout is something that, again, then puts the responsibility on the patient to get better and to fix it, when really these are kind of public solutions that need to be happening. And that's not my expertise. I'm not a public health administrator or things like that. But I do think that it's so important as psychiatrists that work in mental health to take this systemic lens, because this isn't just about giving somebody a prescription for Zoloft. This is also about looking at what are the external structures that are keeping women in this situation.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I also think, what do you tell people when they come to you and say, this is super stressful? I remember going to counseling after John died, and it was very comforting for them to be like, okay, it's normal. Like, what you're experiencing is normal. Because I felt like a different person, I felt like kind of like an alien. And I really like how you say that, like, this is systemic. Like, does that help people, or what else do they need? Because we have all these things. Like, I like yoga. I like baths as much as the next person, like, especially when I'm pregnant. So I'm curious, like, what you say to people to deal with that, or if it's just something where knowing that it's a structural thing actually helps.
Yeah. So that's a hard question, because part of, training to become a psychiatrist is to figure out how to be able to help people hold this suffering, right? Because it is suffering. So, like, part of it is that you have somebody in your corner that is seeing you, that is saying, yes, this is normal. Yes, of course you feel this way. And I'm here with you to help you hold those bad feelings. Another part of it is saying, okay, it's basically kind of like activating that problem solving part of the brain. So you're kind of looking at, like, yes, this feels awful and I'm exhausted and it's not my fault. And are there any ways that we can problem solve and strategize together so we can figure out, is there a way for you to have that bath that you really enjoy having? Or is it like you're afraid to have a hard conversation with your partner so that he can do bedtime one night of the week? And let's look at that avoidance. Or is it,
it's huge. It's huge. I know so many people, they're like, I never wanted to ask my husband for help, and now I have to. And
right.
Just do it.
Right. So kind of, I think the process in therapy is kind of twofold. One is just supportive and helping your patients be able to, I guess, like, sharing the burden of that suffering, sharing those feelings with them so that they don't feel so alone, and validating. And then the other piece is looking at, are there ways that we can move towards change, fully knowing that this is a crappy situation. And we're not going to be, it's not about like benefit versus risk. It's more about risk versus risk, and trying to help keep things together.
I love that idea. Like, it is risk versus risk. It's like picking the lesser of two evils.
Yes, 100%.
Because they're not going to be able to fix it completely.
So if you, like, obviously there's a lot of things that we need to change with the healthcare system, but if you had a magic wand and you could just change one thing overnight, it would be automatically fixed, what would you change and why would you change that?
I feel like this is a really controversial question. Like there's so many things that could be changed. But I think really like the payment model, like doctors need to be, not doctors, all healthcare providers, I think there needs to be a completely different payment model so that especially people that are primary care providers, so pediatricians, family medicine doctors, that they are able to spend more time with their patients. Like the way that the payment model works right now is that you are basically penalized for spending more time with your patients. And one of the reasons that I really liked psychiatry is because, I mean, depending on how you practice, you can have the luxury of having more time with your patients. So I think that that's probably one of the first things that if I had that power or pay grade that I would want to change.
I really like that. Like the idea that you actually pay for helping and you give people enough time to do their job. Like that's so rare. It just doesn't seem to happen. I'm curious. So I want to hear about your Gemma.
Yeah, absolutely.
What made you decide to do that? I didn't know about that until like after we had made this. And
yeah, well, I haven't really, so we're still in beta phase. Okay. So basically I started my Instagram account in December of 2018, and I'm at Women's Mental Health Doc on Instagram. And, as soon as I started my account, I just was like constantly getting DMs from women on Instagram that were just asking all these really good questions, but, things like, is this just stress, or is this depression, or am I allowed to stay on my Zoloft, or, and obviously I can't answer medical questions or give medical advice on social media. But I realized that all of these women were going to influencers to ask these questions. And obviously influencers have no professional training. And then the influencers started reaching out to me and asking me to do takeovers of their stories, which I really liked doing. I would answer questions on stories and things like that. But I realized that there needed to be actually a comprehensive platform where you could go for education about women's mental health. So the other thing on Instagram is that there's all of these classes, but they're all focused on the baby. They're like, learn how to have a vaginal delivery, learn how to breastfeed, sleep training, but there's nothing focused on moms and there's nothing focused on mental health. So it took me about a year to do a lot of research and figure out how to make this happen. And then last March, I launched Gemma in the pandemic, and we do virtual Zoom classes. So our kind of signature class is pregnancy, postpartum, and mental health. And I have 2 OBGYNs right now that came on board, Dr. Marta Perez and Jennifer Lincoln. And so our spring class just wrapped, and it was 5 weeks. And then we also have an asynchronous digital course that's called Unloading the Triple Threat: How to Overcome Mom Guilt, Martyr Mode, and Perfectionism. And that's only $27. So Gemma is very accessible. And things are going awesome, and we're starting to scale. I just hired a CFO who's amazing. And so kind of like on that, path. So yeah, it's been a really amazing learning process for me. And, I just think that it's so important to have a focused resource that's looking at mental health for women and for moms. Because everything else out there is just, yes, you can buy like a cute pair of yoga pants and that's great. Or like, yes, you can buy like a face mask, but like, there's nothing that's really like looking at how can you work with your mind. So it's been really fun for me. And yeah, I'm excited to see where things will go.
I'm really excited. That sounds awesome. And I'm glad that you came to sit down with us in Tristan's first interview. And I also think it's so amazing to have that emphasis on women's mental health, and especially during and after maternity, because it's such a huge need. And I wanted to thank you. And do you have any other thoughts, anybody? Any other questions?
No, this was so fun. Thank you so much for having me. And for folks that are watching, you can follow me at Women's Mental Health Doc on Instagram. And then if you want to check out Gemma, our website is GemmaWomen.com. And thank you so much for all the work that you're doing, Janae.
Thank you. And we'll link to the website as well.
Okay, awesome.